Yeah, thank you so much for agreeing to see us today.
No, my pleasure.
It really is incredible. I know you're incredibly busy. So I'll let the group make their own introductions, and I'll leave you in their capable hands if that's all right.
Oh, right, we're being abandoned.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, this is not my gig. This is theirs. So thank you again. I'll see you at the end.
Righto. Cheers.
Thank you, Stephen. So, thank you, Claire. Just before we start, would you prefer to be called as Claire, Miss Dixon?
Oh, Claire.
Claire, okay, thank you. That makes it much more casual. Um, so nice to meet you, and thank you again, as Stephen said, thank you for taking this time to speak to us. We know you're a very busy woman, I assume. So yeah, we thank you for taking your time. So, as we all know, you were a representative of CAFOD who worked in El Salvador, and that's the topic that we chose, or the country that we chose to speak about in our youth meetings that we have every month here. And we chose El Salvador because obviously we know it's a country with a very high war and conflict background, as you know. So we were all really interested. So before we start, I'm Akash.
My name is
Akash.
Ryan.
Yep.
My name is Jeffrey. My
Right.
name is Aquino.
Aquino.
And I
Akash, Niam, Jeffrey, Aquino.
am Aquino,
Aquino, yes.
as in the former president of the Philippines.
Yes, yes, I didn't think anyone would know that. Yes, very, very good. Okay. He didn't even know that.
Well, you now know. Corazon Aquino, the first female president of the Philippines.
Yes.
Who became president because her husband was the presidential candidate and he was assassinated. And
Mm.
she became the movement for democracy, and there was a people's power movement which backed her. So, yeah.
The more you know. Thank you. So is it okay if we move on to our questions?
Yeah, please, plow ahead.
Thank you. So our first question is just to get to know a bit more about you. So could you please tell us a bit more about your life, career, and what you do at CAFOD?
Well, my life, I was born in the northeast of England. Um, my family was Catholic. I went to a Catholic school, state school, obviously. Um, I did French and Spanish for A levels, and then I went to college and did a degree in modern languages. And that's kind of opened the doors a little bit to me in terms of having an international perspective, um, trying to look at the world and understand the world. My degree was kind of regional studies. So as well as learning French and Spanish, you learnt about history and politics and economics. You know, I really felt at that age I wanted to understand a bit more about how the world works. I lived in Spain for a very short time teaching English when I was, when I finished college, and I got a job working with refugees, asylum seekers. Now, this is in the late 1970s, early 1980s,
Mhm.
and then there were a lot of asylum seekers coming from Chile, where there had been a military government in power. And lots of people had been sent into exile, and lots of people had been sent into prison. And I worked for the Chile Human Rights Committee, which basically campaigned through local groups, a little bit like TCC, to get them to adopt a political prisoner through us and through Amnesty International, and then to work to get them a visa,
Mhm.
so that we could get them out of jail and send them into kind of safe communities here in Britain. And because of that work on Chile, I was recruited into CAFOD, the Catholic Agency for Overseas Development, to work on a big Chile program, which the British government at that point was supporting us to help victims of discrimination and mainly political discrimination in Chile, to help them kind of fight for democracy, freedom,
Mhm.
greater participation, but starting at grassroots level through, building community soup kitchens, looking at issues around hunger and poverty. And that's when I kind of really started to work internationally. And my first year of working in CAFOD was when the war really broke out in El Salvador. And you might have heard of Archbishop Romero.
Yes,
Who
we've got
was
questions about him. Yeah,
right. In that case, yeah.
yeah.
So, I mean, when I started work at CAFOD, CAFOD was really small. There were about, well, fewer than 15 of us. And so we kind of got involved in work across the world. I mean, my special area was Latin America because of the Spanish that I'd learnt, as a student. But we were involved in all sorts of different issues around the world because we all used to kind of muck in and we would do education and we would be writing newsletters and we'd be sending press communiques, so yeah, it was a bit of everything. CAFOD's much bigger now and people are more specialised, but I kind of continued with that overarching across the world viewpoint and always felt that education and working with communities in this country was an essential part of our work. So yeah, I worked in CAFOD. I'm currently a volunteer with CAFOD because I stopped paid work with them last year. So I'm now still involved with CAFOD. I'm involved very much with a small little charity that we've got called the Archbishop Romero Trust, as well as another organisation called Survival International, which works to support the rights of Indigenous communities, many of them in the Amazon, but uncontacted tribal peoples, but people who are affected by land grabbing and climate change and venal governments across the world, really. So yeah,
Yeah.
gives me plenty to do.
Can I just ask before we move to our next question? You said that you were working in El Salvador during the wars. How did you feel about working in El Salvador? Were you scared? Were you?
Yeah, well, I was based in London, but I used
Yeah.
to travel to El Salvador
Yeah.
regularly, and not just El Salvador, but the other countries around it, because
Yeah.
all of the
Yeah.
countries in Central America at that stage, El Salvador, Nicaragua, Guatemala,
Yeah.
Honduras, were all involved in and affected in one way or another by the war, the violence.
Yeah.
So yeah, it was kind of you did feel scared, but probably less scared in the fact that, we were a foreigner, we were coming in, it was the local people who were much more at
Yeah.
risk than we
Yeah.
were.
Definitely. Yeah.
And so we would always be aware that we didn't want to do anything that would bring people into further vulnerability, so
Yeah.
we always had to be very cautious about, speaking on the telephone and,
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
phones were tapped and that kind of stuff. So it was scary. It was particularly scary for, as I say, for the people who we knew. And over the years, many of my friends and the local partner organizations were subjected to violence and killed.
Yeah.
Particularly, I was very close to 6 Jesuits who were working at the university and they were dragged out of their beds one night by the army and shot through the head because they would be working for peace.
Yeah.
Working for peace was a very, very difficult and dangerous thing to do.
Yeah. Standing up for yourself. Yeah.
And, we used to kind of think, well, as foreigners, we're pretty well protected, hopefully. But I was a good friend of a young woman. She was American and she was the same age as me. And in the same year as Archbishop Romero, she was killed by the army because she was working with kids who lost their parents through to violence. Their parents had been killed, and so she was looking after orphans, and that was seen to be dangerous as well.
Yeah. Yeah.
So yeah, it's kind of we lost a lot of close friends and people. So yes, I mean as I say, it was scary,
Yeah.
but not as much for us as it was for the people we were working with.
Yeah, it must have been scary because it was a dangerous country, wasn't it? Especially with all the wars and the gangs. But now it's actually been labeled as one of the most safest countries in the world. There's been so much work done in that country. There's been so much work done in that country, and so much to stop all the, the gangs and the wars, and it's actually been labeled as one of the most safest countries now. Yeah.
Yeah, well, I mean, that's the propaganda.
Yeah.
I mean, I have to say that if only that were the case,
Yeah.
because obviously there weren't any gangs in El Salvador until after the war.
Yeah. Yeah.
The wars, the wars were, kind of came to an end in El Salvador in 1992 with the peace accords.
Yeah.
But the government, which was a very right-wing, very conservative
Yeah.
government at that time, they did not invest in the peace, so the members of the guerrilla organizations who came into legality, they were disarmed and all of their weapons taken away from them. But there was no investment in creating jobs. There were lots of young kids who had been dragooned into the army, and they were demobilized, but their weapons weren't necessarily taken away from them. And then, of course, in the United States, there was a big move from the US government to deport gang members, Latino, Hispanic gang members from their jails. And a lot of people arrived, booted out of the States on aeroplanes, arrived in El Salvador, bringing with them their gang memberships.
Yeah.
And because there was no government support in terms of creating jobs and opportunities, and most of these people had no families. They continued to work as gangs as a means of survival. And so after many years and increasing violence, and of course, drugs became involved in the gang's existence. And elements of different governments were involved in providing protection, and the police were also involved in providing protection. I mean, it was a very complex situation. And then, you had elections in 2018, 2019, and a new government came to power. Somebody quite similar to Trump, only, similar ideological background, but younger, cooler. He was 40 years old. He had a ponytail. He used social media a great deal. And I mean, he's become what he himself calls the coolest dictator in the world.
Yeah.
That's how he describes himself.
Yeah.
And he said, I'm going to get rid of the gangs. Now, there've been a number of efforts of dealing with and negotiation with the gangs, and he declared in 2020 through 2021 a state of emergency. And the state of emergency basically says, I'm going to round up the gangs and I'm going to put them all in jail.
Yeah.
And in the 2.5 years of that state of emergency, he's arrested 85,000 people. Now, if you think the prison population in Britain, I think is about 80,000.
Yeah.
And we're a country of 60 million people. El Salvador's a country of 6 million people. And so you've got 1 or 2% of the adult population of El Salvador in jail because of being suspected of being gangs, and thousands and thousands and thousands.
Yeah,
of
it wasn't even having
no contact at all.
like even having tattoos was a problem at the time, wasn't it?
Having tattoos was, well, 3 things, mainly being male, being young, being poor, and having tattoos.
Yeah.
And I know, I mean, I was in El Salvador just now in November, and you have one part of the population saying, "Oh, isn't it marvelous? My little boy can go out and play in the streets without risk of being impacted by the gangs or affected by the gangs."
Yeah.
And then, another neighbor will say, "My son, who has had nothing to do with the gangs ever, was seized 2 years ago, and I don't know where he is.
Yeah.
I understand that he's in prison." And, she takes food parcels along to the jail every week, but she still has not known whether her son is there or whether he's alive or dead.
Yeah.
And quite often families are finding out that their dads, their brothers, their uncles, that they've been in prison only when their dead bodies are returned to them. So I mean, I was talking to people who are like political scientists and educators and things, people who worked with grassroots organizations and people in the university. And they were saying, we've got two countries. We've got a country which is for the outside world to see and say, it's now the most peaceful country in the world, and they're bigging up tourist attractions. El Salvador's got very good surf apparently, and so they've invested in a whole area of the coastline on the Pacific, calling it Surf City and attracting tourists. But you kind of walk through the center of the town and this army on the streets everywhere with submachine guns, which doesn't really feel like a country which is at peace. I've got a very good friend who she's been quite active in community organizations forever and used to work closely with Archbishop Romero. And we said, how are you feeling about this situation in the country now? And she says, I feel asphyxiated. I feel suffocated because people are scared to speak out. They're scared to kind of say anything against the government. His use of social media is very, very, widespread. And people say that they've got the best, the government has got the best spy media. So, in terms of people's social media, it's not safe. People don't speak openly or communicate openly on TikTok or WhatsApp or Instagram. They do kind of things which disappear quickly on Signal and other bits of social media. So it's a strange place. There are a lot of people who say the general person in the street says, yes, the country is they feel a lot safer in terms of the gangs, but they don't feel safe in terms of being able to be free. It's his policies have been popular with people who've been affected by the violence, but you say, just because a policy of repression is popular doesn't mean to say it's right.
Yeah.
And it's, he's basically, the president is saying, the 85,000 people in jail will never be released.
Yeah.
What kind of society are they going to be building in that situation? So it's but that doesn't mean to say that there aren't lots of groups and people really trying very hard to work for greater democracy, freedom of speech, holding up the values of society, participation, community organizing, which is, the way that they managed to get to the end of the war anyway. And it's got to be a recipe for the future. But free speech is very, very difficult in El Salvador. I'm a very good friend of people at the university there. There's the university where the Jesuits were killed some years ago. And they're under death threats because they speak the truth. And it's very difficult to survive in that kind of pressure.
Thank
I'm
you.
painting a very depressing picture.
Yeah, no, I was going to
It's a
say,
wonderful
yeah.
country.
Yeah, no, it's hard to talk about, like bad experiences and people you've lost, obviously. So thank you for sharing that with us.
No, my pleasure. My pleasure.
So, how did groups like CAFOD help with peace building, like before and after the conflicts in El Salvador?
Oof. Well, I mean, during the conflict, I worked in CAFOD from, oh goodness, going a long way back, before your parents were born, I bet.
Wow.
From 1978. I was fortunate in that I was working at CAFOD when Archbishop Romero was the Archbishop, because he was the Archbishop from 1977 to 1980 when he was killed. And so we did a lot of work to support Archbishop Romero. He had, first of all, he was very committed to ensuring that people knew the truth. He had a radio station, and he used to broadcast weekly information about what was happening in the country, about the violence that was taking place, pleading for peace, working for peace. We used to fund his radio station, his communications programs, and they kept getting blown up, because the government didn't like what he was saying, and so his radio antenna would be dynamited. And every time it was blown up, CAFOD provided them with money to be able to rebuild. He was doing a lot of work, and as were all the churches, there was a big ecumenical movement, really. He was doing a lot of work in providing support to people who had fled from their homes because of the violence. There was an open war going on, and not just war. I mean, before the war started, it was repression. It was the government, the army, who were going around killing people who they suspected of being social activists or opponents, or people who were left wing, or people who, they regarded as some kind of threat. And so you had people being killed, disappeared, and that was what Archbishop Romero was calling out against. But also offering protection to people who had fled the violence in refugee camps, people who took refuge in local community centres, who took refuge in churches. The churches altogether were offering a lot of protection for people, but also helping people to get out of the country and into refugee camps in neighbouring countries as well. And Archbishop Romero set up a human rights office, which CAFOD has continued to provide support for even to now, to look at, people who were affected. You would get young kids who were picked up on their way to school or on the way to college, and their parents would go looking for them, and they go to the police station, they would go to hospitals to find out and their last port of call would be to go to the church to say, do you know what is, can you help me find my loved one, my son, my daughter? And in the Archbishop's office, they used to have a group of people who used to go around rubbish dumps, because that's where the dead bodies would be taken and abandoned. And they would take photographs of people who had been tortured to death. And, the parents, mainly the mothers, would come along and go through these awful photographs to see if they could identify their child. And CAFOD provided support to those mothers to be able to enable them to be there, to pay their bus fares, to be able to do it. They said, look, we're going to continue to do this.
Yeah.
What CAFOD is doing helps us to provide a word of support, encouragement, hope, a cup of coffee or a biscuit, to these women who are, mourning perhaps the death of their children. And through that human rights office, we provided them with legal assistance. And then, of course, during the war, we worked a lot in those areas of conflict where people were under siege all the time, trying to provide them through the local church with protection, with encouragement, and with a voice. And of course, giving that voice internationally. We had lots of visitors from El Salvador, from the church, human rights lawyers, etc., who came to Britain, to Europe, to talk about what was happening. We put them in contact with members of the British government, with parliamentarians, in the same way as during his lifetime in 1978 and 79, we managed to get 60 members of parliament in Britain to sign a nomination for Archbishop Romero to get the Nobel Peace Prize.
Yes.
We didn't think he would get the Nobel Peace Prize, but it was a means of trying to keep him in the public eye, to give publicity to what was happening in El Salvador. And so it was our work as CAFOD was working locally with the church, working internationally with the church. And CAFOD was a member of a network of different charitable organisations, not just in Britain, but in France, Germany, Spain, Italy, and working across the world in issues of solidarity, really, and support.
Just going back to what you said about the photos, like as a parent, it must have been devastating to look through those photos and actually find your son or daughter.
Can you imagine? Yeah,
Yeah.
can you imagine? Just, and so just for someone to be there, to listen to them, to hear their, and to provide support, because I can remember that the first time that I went to El Salvador, going along and meeting some of those women, and one of the women, started telling us about how her husband had disappeared and her son had disappeared, and then she was picked up herself, and the death squad basically left her for dead. After having tortured her horribly, and I won't give you the details of the torture because it's too awful.
Yeah.
And she said, but I need to keep hope alive, not just for myself, but for other women like me who come here. And I think, a big issue around hope, if we look at today's world, where you look at the situation in Gaza,
Yeah.
CAFOD works and has worked for years and years in the occupied territories, and in the West Bank, and just trying to keep hope alive for people. We can't necessarily resolve the situation, but one of the organisations that CAFOD works with is the Jerusalem Legal Aid Centre, which works through, when you have the settlers going in and trying to occupy land in the West Bank, they have lawyers who try and work through the courts to stop the bulldozers from coming in. If your local Palestinian school is going to be bulldozed, then there's a stay of execution. And it's not going to solve the problem, but it's going to give people that sense of solidarity, the sense that they're not forgotten, the sense that, there are things that they can do. And yeah, I think part of CAFOD's job, whether it's in Gaza or whether it's in Ukraine or whether it's in El Salvador, is how do we work to keep hope alive and to say that, we can work for, well, exactly what you're doing, really. TCC. It's working at the grassroots in communities, working at intermediary levels with your local councils, and working politically through your local parliamentary representatives, and bringing change for the better. With that whole idea of the church has been very strong in Latin America, talking about the option for the poor. In a situation where there is injustice, the church has to be on the side of people who are poor.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thanks. I think it's quite important for us actually to learn about like the full like the background story of CAFOD, because from a certain like a young age we've all grown up learning about we didn't really learn about CAFOD, but in primary school, St. Mary's, that they'd always say that if on Unclothes Day, if you bring in £1, it gets donated to CAFOD, and we've heard that many times, but we never really got to know what CAFOD does. So we all just thought that the CAFOD takes the money and then just gives it to the government to help the people, but we never really got a true understanding of what it does.
Yeah. No, the one thing that we don't do is give it to governments.
Yeah.
Because quite often it's the governments who are the ones who are causing the problems.
Yeah.
But, as I was saying, earlier when I first started at CAFOD, we used to work, I worked on Latin America specifically, but we used to work on lots of things as well. And just thinking of the things that CAFOD did, in South Africa during the time of the apartheid regime, providing funding to the local church organizations to support the democratic movements, helping people to go into hiding, helping families who had their, members of their family killed or in exile, helping them to have a funeral. And that's the kind of thing that, we've also been doing in a place like Colombia. Colombia is a place where, there's been war going on for 60 years now,
Yeah.
since the 1960s. And how to work within a war situation, within a conflict situation, to keep communities together, to give them hope, and to enable them, or to ensure that communities are not disempowered, but that they organize. And, so in Colombia, where I worked a lot as well over the years, saying if peace at a national level is not possible, maybe peace at a local level is possible. Maybe by working in the local environment, we can bring groups together who would never agree at a national level, but who can agree on certain basic principles to work together for the local community, for the common good. And as I say, CAFOD is not the organization which does this. We work with and support the organizations, the local organizations. They're the people doing the work. We're the ones who are in a very privileged position to be able to know and understand what they're doing, and to say, how can we make your job a bit easier? And often that's through providing them with resources so that they can decide what action they're going to take.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, I would like to know more about Oscar Romero. Oscar Romero was the most important reason we took this El Salvador topic.
Yes.
Like, we get to know about him like during our GCSEs in our break. It's the first time I get to know about Oscar Romero. If I go back to when you said Oscar Romero got like international voice, how did the world get to know about him? Like, how did he get that international voice? Like,
Gosh, well, that's it. Yeah, I mean, nobody's ever heard about El Salvador, really. I think one of the issues that made it more of an international issue was because the war in El Salvador became very important for the United States. We knew that there was all of this conflict going on in the country, because CAFOD is very closely related to what's happening in the church around the world, and in countries around the world through the church. And, Archbishop Romero was somebody who we were in contact with. And as I say, I never had the good fortune to meet him personally, but I did used to write to him, and he used to write back, So yeah, because we used to support as I say, the projects for his radio station, his communications program, and all of the emergency work that he did with displaced people who were, kind of fleeing from the violence. And we knew that this was something that we had to tell the world about. But it was given an international dimension by the fact that the United States government was funding massive military assistance into the government of El Salvador to support the very people who were responsible for killing Archbishop Romero, And so there was a big international dimension to El Salvador because of the involvement of the United States. And they kind of said, well, it was a war that they were fighting for freedom and against communism. It wasn't people fighting for communism. It was people fighting for democracy, basic capacity to have their voices heard. And in a country where you had, they talked about the 14 very wealthy families who owned the country. They owned the coffee plantations, they owned the land. And Archbishop Romero used to denounce the exploitation of the poor, the fact that laborers, worked for a pittance and couldn't feed their families and couldn't educate their families. And, we had a history over many, many years of the United States always used to choose the wrong side to support. Because, they would say, we're fighting against communism. No, they were usually fighting against the principles of democracy, which the United States said it was upholding. And so there was that, as I say, the international dimension. And in the US, there was a lot of grassroots organizations linked to the churches, linked to democratic movements, who basically, did a lot of work to publicize the situation in El Salvador. Here in this country, he's just retired last year, but there was a very famous newsreader on Channel 4 called John Snow. And John Snow and a number of other journalists who we were in contact with were very, very interested in the situation in El Salvador and would go there very regularly to report on it. We campaigned a lot in CAFOD and in other organisations, along with Christian Aid, which is another organisation, and Oxfam, to stop the British government from providing armoured cars to El Salvador, to the El Salvador army, because, there was a lot of pressure for them to do so. We had, as I say, we invited speakers to come over. We ensured that those people met with government officials. We had, during the times of, well, I suppose, throughout the 70s and 80s, we had a very conservative government. We had Mrs. Thatcher. And we rallied around normally the opposition, the Labour members of Parliament, Neil Kinnock being somebody who was very important for us, but the churches particularly talking about justice. And so we did everything we could to bring some kind of informed comment to what was happening, because El Salvador became a big news story because there was a war.
So how did the people react when they heard the news about the assassination of Father Romero? Like, did that escalate to civil war? Did that escalate to?
Well, at the time of his death, and you probably know the reasons behind the immediate reasons why he was killed. I mean, basically, he had written a letter to the United States government begging them not to arm the army who were killing people. And then in his desperation, he made a call to the armed forces and said to the soldiers, it is against God's law to kill your brothers, and he said, I beg you, I beseech you, stop the killing, stop the repression. And that was a week later, he was gunned down when he was saying mass. That was the reaction was enormous. I mean, this is the first time ever in history that an archbishop was killed whilst he was saying mass. There are a couple of archbishops in history, kind of St. Thomas of Becket was killed in his cathedral. When was that? In the 15th century? And then there was an archbishop in Poland who was killed in 16th century, I think. But the first time ever, and the only time ever in the world, that a Catholic archbishop was gunned down as he was just about to do the offertory in the mass, that sent shockwaves, not just around El Salvador, but around the world. And, in Central America, it had a big impact, but in the United States, it had a very, very big impact. But what had happened, I mean, he had managed to hold off a full-scale civil war. And I think it was when he was killed, it was realized that, people felt, or at least the guerrilla organizations felt, that there was nothing for it but to fight. And sadly, that war lasted from 1980 to 1992, and 65,000 people were killed. But the war was kept alive by the millions and millions and millions of dollars that were being poured in from the United States, mainly under President Reagan.
As you said, like, there's a big impact in the US. Did the US government stop funding the war to El Salvador at that time, or did they keep going?
They kept funding, and then there was a turning point came in 1989. Now, in 1989, something on the world stage happened, which was important for El Salvador because, you know, the US had been saying, oh, this is a fight against communism in El Salvador. In November 1989, the Berlin Wall fell, you know, so it was the end of communism in Europe. There was no reason to be able to say, you know, communism in Central America was never going to happen. And a week after the Berlin Wall fell, 6 Jesuits and 2 women who worked with them in the Catholic University in El Salvador were killed. Now, those 6 Jesuits were all friends of mine. They had their brains blown out by the army. And of course, the government of El Salvador tried to pretend that it was the guerrillas who'd killed them.
Yeah.
But it wasn't. It was a special battalion of the army called the Atla Brigade, who had been trained in the United States.
Yeah.
And so the reputation of the United States then, and of course, the US basically has been saying we're fighting communism, but communism at a world level had disappeared. And so the killing of the Jesuits was one of the big causes of a change in policy from the United States. And they started to support the peace proposals, which the United Nations had been working for years. And CAFOD had been trying to support the people working for peace throughout all of those years, you know, at the same time as providing kind of material support to the poor sectors of society who were being affected by the war. Also, just trying to be, you know, as Archbishop Romero had said, being the microphones of God, trying to broadcast what this message was of peace and justice, that you can't have peace, which is just a piece of the graveyard. It's got to be peace with justice and democracy and dignity.
Yeah, we're all interested about like Oscar Romero and El Salvador because in high school, 3 of us have moved on now to further education, and he's still in high school. But when we were in high school, our form classes were all named after, like I'd like to say they're all martyrs. So obviously mine was Oscar Romero. Our form class was called Oscar Romero, and the others were you probably know them all. Maximilian Kolbe.
Oh yeah.
I don't know the first name, but Cassidy.
Sheila Cassidy.
Sheila Cassidy.
Oh gosh, well, Sheila Cassidy was my boss.
Oh,
Time.
yeah, yeah,
yeah. Because she was a doctor in Chile, and she came back when she was released from Chile. She came back and she became the president of the Chile Human Rights Committee where I'd worked. So
yeah. So we had Romero, Maximilian Kolbe, Martin Luther King.
Yeah.
Was the 4th one, and Sean Devereaux was the 5th one. Yeah, they were our form martyrs or role models that we looked up to. Yeah. So thank you.
But one of the things that was really interesting here is that you know, we were always pressing the church here every year. I mean, there are churches around Britain, England, Wales, and Scotland, and Ireland, who you know, had memorials for Archbishop Romero every year on the anniversary of his death.
Yeah.
And the church, you know, at a world level, the Catholic Church didn't recognize him as a saint for very many years, but the Anglican Church did, even though they don't make saints, you know. But in Westminster Abbey, over the main door of Westminster Abbey, there are what they call the martyrs of the 20th century, and Oscar Romero and Martin Luther King are standing next to each other as the statues.
Yeah.
In Westminster Abbey.
Yeah.
And of course, it was when Pope Francis became Pope.
Yeah.
That really, they kind of said, you know, let's look seriously at Oscar Romero, because the Salvadorian government had been pressing Rome and the previous Pope, not to recognize him because they'd killed him, you know.
Yeah.
They didn't want to be responsible for being seen to have killed a saint. But it was Pope Francis who, about a month after he was installed as Pope, he said to the Holy Office, which looks at the causes of saints,
Yeah.
take that out of the deep freeze. We want this man beatified and made a saint.
Yeah. Thank you, Claire. Just looking at the time, I think the meeting will automatically end at 2 p.m. This is meant to be a quick 15-minute, 20-minute.
Oh, right.
podcast.
Sorry about this. I'm a bit long-winded.
Before, no, it's not your fault. Before we actually started, we were thinking how are we going to speak for 30 minutes? But it's
It felt natural.
felt natural.
Yeah.
Felt like a conversation with my best friend. Yeah. So I think we've got time for just one more quick question, just to end it off. The 8th question,
So what are some easy things that like regular people like us can do to promote anti-war and peace?
Well, what they say, think globally and act locally. You've got to have a kind of a worldwide perspective on what motivates you, and to be aware of what's happening in the world. And you say, well, what can I do about it here? And you start at home, and you start at school, and you start at college, and you start in your local community and with your youth groups and everything. That's certainly been the way that I think, what is it that you can become involved in, which is about doing good in your local community, fighting injustice, fighting discrimination, and obviously supporting organisations like CAFOD, like local food banks, like I think in Wrexham, I think you've got that, is it sanctuary cities or sanctuary towns and things, trying to create a safe environment for refugees and people.
Oh yeah, we've got yeah.
Those kinds of things, because they are, and use the political power that you have, young people being active in, pressurizing your local MP or, going on marches. I mean, in my day, we used to do lots of demonstrations and marches.
Yeah.
It's been less common, and obviously during COVID, all of that kind of thing was impossible. But now it's, it's possible to mobilize, act, do things, write letters, use music.
Yeah.
But there's so much. I mean, we always used to say in CAFOD, I mean, you said, you used to go along for fast day and you would put your pound in, and we know kids at school haven't got money to give to CAFOD, but you can go out on demos and you can be involved in the campaigns that CAFOD does and different organisations do. It tends to be, people who are older and once their family responsibilities, older people who've got some funding that they can give to CAFOD. But, we know that young people are a very important voice. A voice for change, a voice for a better future, a voice for justice,
Thank you. So that was very good, Claire. Thank you.
Well, anytime.
On behalf of me and all of us sat here and Stephen, a massive thank you for taking the time.
Thanks to you. Stephen came back in wondering what on earth is going on 3/4 of an hour later.
Yeah.
Thanks again so much, Claire. I'm so proud of these young gentlemen. I think they've done an amazing job. Thank you for giving us your time once again.
No, it's my pleasure. I feel kind of enthused just by talking to you all.
Amazing. Thanks so much, Claire. We'll be in touch.
Yeah, thanks a million. Best of luck, lads.
Thank you. See you. Bye.
Nice to meet you.
Fabulous.
Bye.